My cousin is a police officer who thought he was smart enough to frame an 18-year-old for a felony just to steal a multi-million-dollar inheritance. He stood in my grandfather's living room, looked me dead in the eye, and told me he'd have me arrested for gun negligence if I didn't pack my bags and disappear. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd isolated our grandfather and secured his payday. But he forgot one thing. My grandfather knew exactly what kind of vultures were circling his estate. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this is the story of a nuclear will and a revenge so perfectly timed it destroyed a man's career, his marriage, and his bank account in less than 30 minutes. My cousin didn't realize that by winning the house, he'd actually walked straight into a trap I'd set using nothing but his own bottomless greed. He walked out of that house with 4 shoeboxes full of Grandma's jewelry, and in doing so, he forfeited every single penny he was ever supposed to receive. He lost millions because he couldn't resist a few handfuls of gold. Before we get to the moment my cousin's life imploded, I need a quick favor. If you love seeing greedy family members get exactly what's coming to them, hit that subscribe button. I'm sharing the second half of this story, the one involving the FBI and the IRS later this week, and you definitely don't want to miss that chaos. This whole saga started 25 years ago when my aunt passed away. I was just a baby, but for my 2 cousins, who were in their early 20s at the time, it was a life-altering tragedy. My grandparents were incredibly wealthy, the kind of wealthy where they didn't just have money, they had rules for it. They'd put a clause in their will stating that if a parent died before the grandkids reached age 30, those kids would get half of their inheritance immediately. The younger cousin was smart. She paid off her student loans and bought a plot of land she still owns today. But the older sibling, my cop cousin, he was a different story altogether. He blew through his entire fortune in 6 years. It was like something straight out of the Bible, the prodigal son, but without the happy ending. By the time I was starting middle school, he was broke, living in a tiny condo, and working as a police officer just to stay afloat. But the money wasn't his only problem. Everyone in our small family knew he had a serious substance issue, and his officer's salary was barely covering his habits. Over the next 4 years, my cousin went to rehab 3 different times. Each stay was fully sponsored by my grandparents, who genuinely wanted to see him survive. He finally sobered up when he got his girlfriend pregnant. I use the term sober loosely, but he was at least functional. The woman he married, though? She was a piece of work, a nurse by trade but a gold digger by heart. She didn't see my grandparents as family. She saw them as a walking payday. We all knew she'd baby-trapped him, thinking she'd hit the lottery. Within 7 years, they had 3 kids. Her insurance policy. "We just need a little boost this month," she'd say, her voice dripping with fake sweetness as she sat in my grandfather's kitchen. With the 3 kids and the mortgage, things are just so tight. Being the kind spirits they were, my grandparents always reached for their checkbook. My father and I watched from the sidelines, sick to our stomachs. It wasn't about the money. It was about the manipulation. They were draining my grandparents' kindness like leeches, and they were just getting started. When my grandmother passed away when I was 17, the nurse wife didn't even wait for the funeral to finish before she started eyeing my grandfather's remaining estate. After Grandma passed, I became the one person standing between my cousin and his payday. I was undoubtedly my grandfather's favorite. It wasn't because I wanted his money. I just loved the man. I had 2 years left before college, so I moved in to keep him company and help him around the house. My cousin and his wife absolutely hated this. To them, I wasn't a grandson. I was a barricade. They started a campaign of petty psychological warfare. My room had these grand double doors that unfortunately couldn't be locked from the outside. Whenever I wasn't home, my cousin would conveniently let his 3 kids, I called them the gremlins, run wild. I'd come home to find my school books torn, my clothes thrown across the floor, and my personal belongings smashed. "Oh, you know how kids are," his wife would say with a shrug when I confronted her. "They just wanted to play with their big cousin. Don't be so sensitive." But it wasn't just the kids. My cousin was a professional at being a nuisance. He actually hid one of those tiny mechanical noisemakers in my cabinet, a device that let out a random, high-pitched beep every few hours. It was designed to make me feel like I was losing my mind, making me irritable so I'd snap at Grandpa. Thankfully, my German shepherd, Luna, finally sniffed it out after a week. But the message was clear. They wanted me out, and they didn't care how dirty they had to play to make it happen. The dynamic in the house changed when I turned 18. My grandfather was a man who believed in self-reliance, but his body was failing him. Arthritis had turned his hands into stiff, swollen claws, and nerve degeneration meant he couldn't even grip a glass of water without it shaking, let alone aim a firearm. One evening, he sat me down in his study, the smell of old leather and pipe tobacco hanging heavy in the air. "Son," he said, his voice raspy but firm, "I can't protect this house anymore. That's on you now." He officially placed the responsibility of the home's defense in my hands. I was well trained and took it with a sense of immense pride. However, the rules were ironclad. If I see a weapon out for any reason other than cleaning, there will be hell to raise. I respected that. I kept my handgun in a heavy steel lockbox bolted inside my nightstand. The magazine was kept in the box, but never, and I mean never, loaded into the weapon. I kept the key on a high, recessed shelf that I could barely reach myself. There was no way a 6-year-old child could find it, let alone reach it. I felt secure. I felt trusted. But I didn't realize that a police officer knows exactly how to look for hidden keys, and my cousin was tired of playing games with noisemakers. He was ready for a kill shot. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I'd only been gone for 45 minutes to pick up Grandpa's favorite deli order. When I walked through the front door, the silence in the house was heavy, thick and cold. I walked into the living room and froze. My cousin, his wife, and my grandfather were all standing around the mahogany coffee table. Sitting right there in plain sight was my handgun. My heart plummeted. I didn't even have to look close to see the slide was forward. There was a round in the chamber. It was ready to fire. The steel lockbox that was supposed to be bolted in my room was gone. "One of the kids found this, OP," my cousin said. He was standing in his full police uniform, chest puffed out, hands resting on his utility belt. He was playing with it in the hallway. "Do you have any idea how lucky we are that he didn't blow his head off?" "That's impossible," I stammered, my hands shaking. "That gun was locked. The key is on a 7-foot shelf. A 6-year-old didn't get into that box, Derek, and I never keep a round chambered in the house. Never." "Are you calling my son a liar?" the nurse wife hissed, stepping toward me. "He found it under your bed. You're reckless. You're a danger to this family." I looked at my cousin. I saw the faint, smug glint in his eyes. He had found the key. He had loaded the weapon. He had staged the entire scene to make me look like a negligent criminal. "I'm a cop," my cousin barked, his voice booming in the small room. I should arrest you right now for child endangerment. The only reason I haven't is because we're family. But you're done here. Get your things and get out of this house before I change my mind." I looked at my grandfather, pleading with my eyes for him to see through the theater. But he looked tired, older than I'd ever seen him. The disinformation had done its work. My cousin, the expert law enforcement officer, had just told him his favorite grandson was a hair trigger away from killing a child. "I think it's best you go back to your parents for a while, son," Grandpa said, his voice barely a whisper, "until things cool down." I was devastated. I packed my bags under the watchful, triumphant glare of my cousin. I tried to explain the impossibility of the situation to Grandpa the next day over the phone. He listened, and he even agreed that the key was out of reach, but the seed of doubt had been planted. He was confused and hurt. A month later, I was just starting to find a rhythm at my parents' house, planning a lunch to finally sit down and show Grandpa how I'd been framed. Then, the phone rang. A massive heart attack. At 86, his heart just gave out. I never got that lunch. I never got to fully clear my name. To this day, the thought that he might have died thinking I was a reckless kid who didn't value his trust eats at me. My cousin and his wife didn't even look sad at the funeral. They looked like they were waiting for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. They had sealed the payday, or so they thought. With Grandpa gone, the mask slipped. My cousin and his wife immediately pivoted their charm offensive toward my father. Since my dad was the only surviving child, he was the primary gatekeeper to the estate. For 2 months, they were at our house constantly, bringing over casseroles, offering to mow the lawn, and acting like they hadn't just spent a year trying to destroy my reputation. "We're just so worried about the estate being handled correctly," the nurse wife would say, her eyes darting around our living room as if she were already appraising our furniture. Finally, the day arrived. My grandfather's lawyer, a man who looked like he was made of old parchment and expensive wool, sat us down. Per my grandparents' specific instructions, the cousins were to be briefed on their shares individually, but the immediate family, my parents, my sister, and I, received the full reading first. The lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. He read through the standard distributions, but then he reached the section that made the air in the room feel electric. "There is a specific provision," the lawyer stated, "added by your father and mother 5 years ago. It states, if any beneficiary attempts to claim, seize, or manipulate any part of the estate that is not explicitly assigned to them, they shall immediately forfeit all assets they were otherwise entitled to receive. Such forfeited shares will be divided equally among the remaining family members." My dad looked at me. I looked at the lawyer. The nuclear clause was real. The lawyer's words echoed in the quiet room. If anyone attempts to claim, they forfeit everything. It was the ultimate greedy bastard trap. My dad was the sole heir to every physical property, the house, the cars, the contents, except for a few specific items. My cousin, however, believed that since the estate's value had skyrocketed, he was entitled to a fair slice of the new pie, regardless of the will. I knew his weakness. He was a scavenger. He couldn't help himself if he thought he was getting away with a victimless crime. I leaned over to my dad and whispered, "I think it's time Derek got exactly what he's been looking for." The next morning I called him. I kept my voice sounding defeated, like I'd given up. "Hey Derek, look. The lawyer told us that Grandma's jewelry collection is being sent to a charity auction on Friday. Apparently, they want to clear the house out fast for the estate sale. I could practically hear his pulse quickening over the phone. A charity auction? He repeated, his voice tight. The whole collection? That seems wasteful. I agree, I lied. I mean, if a few pieces disappeared before the trucks arrived, who would even know? The charity certainly wouldn't. I gave him the bait. The idea that he could sneak in, grab a handful of diamonds, and nobody would be the wiser. He bit so hard, I'm surprised he didn't break a tooth. I knew the exact moment the trap would spring. My dad and the lawyer were scheduled to do a formal walkthrough of the estate that afternoon to begin the final inventory. My cousin, fueled by the lie I'd fed him about the charity trucks, had a very narrow window to commit his heist. He didn't waste a second. According to my dad's testimony, when they pulled into the driveway, they noticed my cousin's personal car tucked behind a large hedge near the side entrance. They walked into the house quietly. The air was still until they heard the sound of drawers slamming and the frantic clinking of metal against metal coming from the master bedroom. They waited in the kitchen. On the counter sat 3 large shoe boxes, overflowing with gold chains, pearl necklaces, and velvet pouches containing Grandma's most precious gems. My cousin had been busy. A moment later, he walked into the kitchen carrying a 4th shoebox. He was sweating, his face flushed with the adrenaline of the theft. He stopped dead. He looked at my father. He looked at the lawyer, who was already holding a clipboard and a camera. "Derek," my father said, his voice cold as ice. "What exactly are you doing with my mother's jewelry?" The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of millions of dollars vanishing into thin air. Derek's face went from flushed red to a ghostly, sickly white. He tried to stammer out an excuse, his hands still clutching the 4th shoebox like a life raft. I was just securing these. OP told me they were being donated, and I didn't want the charity workers to... To what? The lawyer interrupted, his voice sharp and clinical. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the 4 boxes of evidence. To take items that were explicitly designated as part of the primary estate. Items that, per the will, do not belong to you? My cousin looked at my dad, pleading. "Uncle, come on. It's just some jewelry. I'm family. I was trying to help." The lawyer didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Mr. Cousin's name, as an officer of the law, I'm sure you understand the concept of intent. You have bypassed the executor and attempted to remove assets from the property. In doing so, you have triggered Article 14, Section B of your grandfather's will. The forfeiture clause," my dad added, crossing his arms. The realization hit Derek like a physical blow. By trying to save a few $100,000 in jewelry, he had just legally signed away his rights to a multi-million-dollar cash payout. In 30 minutes, he had gambled his entire future on 4 shoeboxes, and he had lost everything. The fallout was swifter and more brutal than I ever could have imagined. When Derek crawled back to his house and told his wife that he'd been caught and that their lottery ticket had been burned to a crisp, the nurse wife didn't offer him comfort. She offered him divorce papers. It turns out her devotion was tied directly to the size of my grandfather's bank account. Without the impending millions, she had no interest in being married to a disgraced cop with a history of substance issues and 3 kids to support. She filed within weeks, stripping him of what little he had left. We haven't heard a single word from him in nearly 6 years. He vanished from the family circle entirely, a man disgraced and broken by his own hand. My father, sister, and I divided the forfeited share of the estate, using it to build the lives my grandparents wanted for us. I'll be honest, some might call this a fairy tale ending. My loans are gone, my parents are comfortable, and the villain is out of the picture. But I'd give every single cent of that inheritance back just to have one more lunch with my grandfather, to sit on that porch and tell him face to face that I never would have broken his trust. I think he knows, though. Somewhere, I think he's smiling, knowing that the nuclear will he wrote finally did its job. But don't go anywhere just yet. Remember how I mentioned an unknown family member and a massive lawsuit involving the FBI and the IRS? That is a whole different level of chaos that happened shortly after Derek's downfall. It turns out Derek wasn't the only one with secrets, and the government decided to come knocking on our family's door. If you want to hear the other part of the story, the federal investigation that nearly took us all down, drop a part 2 in the comments right now and make sure you're subscribed. The peace following Derek's downfall lasted exactly 4 months. I was sitting in my parents' kitchen, celebrating my first dean's list at college, when the driveway didn't just fill with a car, it filled with a convoy. 3 black SUVs, the kind that look like they're built of shadows and armor, pulled up in a perfect line. My dad looked out the window, his face going pale. "I don't think those are more appraisers," he whispered. There was a knock at the door. Not a polite tap, but the heavy, rhythmic thud of someone who doesn't need an invitation. When my dad opened it, he wasn't greeted by a neighbor. He was looking at 2 men in windbreakers with 3 letters printed in bold, yellow block text across the back. FBI. "Are you the executor of the estate?" the lead agent asked. He didn't wait for an answer before stepping over the threshold. Behind him, a woman in a sharp suit held up a badge. "I'm Agent Miller with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. We have a warrant to seize all financial records related to your late father's offshore holdings." Offshore holdings? My grandfather was a man who bought his socks at Costco and drove a 15-year-old truck. We stood there in stunned silence as they began to explain that Derek's greed hadn't just triggered a will, it had tripped a silent alarm at the federal level. As the agents began boxing up my grandfather's files, they dropped a name that made my father's heart stop. Arthur. Arthur was my grandfather's younger brother, a man who had moved to the Cayman Islands in the late 80s and was essentially a ghost in our family tree. We were told he had passed away years ago. But according to Agent Miller, Arthur wasn't just alive. He had been using my grandfather's domestic accounts as a clearinghouse for a massive international shell game. "Your cousin Derek didn't just try to steal jewelry," Agent Miller explained, sitting at our dining table. "In his desperation to find more money, he started poking into your grandfather's digital accounts. He tried to move a large sum from a dormant account he found. He thought he was being clever, but that account was flagged by the Treasury Department 3 years ago. Derek, in his infinite stupidity, had tried to hack into a secret family fund to replace the inheritance he'd forfeited. In doing so, he didn't just fail, he accidentally alerted the federal government to a multi-million-dollar tax evasion scheme run by a great-uncle we barely knew existed. "We're not just here for the taxes," the FBI agent added. "We're here because Arthur isn't just a tax evader. He's a person of interest in a much darker investigation." For the next 6 hours, my house felt like a precinct. They separated us. I was put in the den, while my parents were questioned in the kitchen. The air smelled like the agents' cheap coffee and the ozone of their portable scanners. "Did your grandfather ever mention Arthur?" the agent asked me. He was leaning back in my dad's favorite recliner, looking at me like I was a puzzle he was tired of solving. I didn't even know Arthur was alive until 20 minutes ago, I said, my voice cracking. I felt like a criminal in my own home. I thought about the gun frame-up, how I'd been kicked out of Grandpa's house. I realized then that if I had been living there when Derek tried to hack those accounts, I'd probably be in handcuffs right now. Derek told us you were the one who knew the passwords, the agent said, dropping a bombshell. My blood turned to ice. Even after losing everything, even after the divorce and the disgrace, Derek was still trying to bury me. From whatever hole he was hiding in, he had told the FBI that I was the mastermind behind the offshore accounts. He was trying to trade my freedom for his own. He's lying, I whispered. He's a disgraced cop who lost his inheritance. He's trying to burn the whole house down because he can't have it. The FBI didn't take my word for it. Not at first. They spent 2 days scouring our computers, our bank statements, and every scrap of paper my grandfather had ever signed. But as they dug deeper, the truth started to emerge, and it was much worse for Derek than for us. They found the mechanical noisemaker I'd kept in a drawer. They found the receipts for the lockbox he'd broken. And most importantly, they found the digital bread box Derek had created on his work computer, using his police credentials to bypass security protocols. He had committed a federal crime while using government equipment. We went to pick up your cousin for questioning this morning, Agent Miller told us on the 3rd day. Her expression was grim. He's gone. His ex-wife says he cleared out his remaining personal belongings and left his badge on the kitchen counter. He's a fugitive now. The realization hit me. Derek knew the FBI was coming. He had tried to pin the Arthur accounts on me to buy himself enough time to disappear. He wasn't just a bully or a thief anymore. He was a criminal on the run, leaving his children and his family to deal with the fallout of his greed. As the investigation continued, we learned the true scale of what we were dealing with. My grandfather wasn't just wealthy. He was the unwitting custodian of a fortune that didn't belong to him. Arthur had been gifting money into my grandfather's estate for decades, small enough amounts to avoid immediate red flags, but totaling millions over time. Your grandfather might not have known the source, the IRS agent admitted, but he definitely knew the money wasn't coming from his pension. He kept it in a separate trust that none of you were supposed to see until he passed. This was the other inheritance, the one that wasn't in the main will, the one Derek had sniffed out like a bloodhound. We sat in the lawyer's office, the same one who had handled the jewelry trap, as he laid out the new reality. Because this money is tied to an active federal investigation into Arthur, the entire estate is currently frozen. Every penny. Your dad's inheritance, your college fund, even the house, it's all under a federal lien. The revenge I'd taken on Derek had been a clean strike, but Derek's desperate counterattack had dragged us all into the mud. We were debt-free on paper, but in reality, we were one legal ruling away from losing everything Grandpa had actually worked for. We need to find Arthur, the lawyer said. He's the only one who can clear your grandfather's name, and we need to find him before the FBI finds Derek. Wait, things just got real. We went from a petty family feud to an international FBI manhunt. Do you think my grandfather was in on it, or was he just a victim of his brother's schemes? Comment Team Grandpa or Team Feds below. And if you haven't yet, subscribe because the next part involves a literal chase across the border. Let's keep going. The FBI had frozen our lives, but they hadn't frozen our brains. My dad sat at the kitchen table staring at an old, yellowed photograph of my grandfather and Arthur from 1974. "Arthur isn't a ghost," my dad whispered. "He's a creature of habit." While the feds were looking for digital footprints, my dad remembered a detail from a letter Arthur had sent 20 years ago, something about a blue house with a yellow door near Rum Point. We knew the FBI would block us if we tried to leave the country on a whim, but my father still had his own savings that hadn't been touched by the estate land. "We're going," he said. "If Arthur is the key to clearing your name and saving the house, we find him before he disappears forever." 2 days later, we weren't in our small town anymore. The humid, salt-thick air of Grand Cayman hit us like a physical wall. It was a world of turquoise water and blinding white sand, a place where people came to forget their pasts or hide their futures. We felt like tourists in a spy novel, out of place in our generic polos and nervous expressions. We spent 48 hours scouring the coast, showing Arthur's old photo to bartenders and boat captains. Most ignored us, but one old man at a dock looked at the photo and spat into the water. "That's not Arthur," he grumbled in a thick accent. "That's the accountant, and you're about the 4th people this week looking for him." "Who else is looking for him?" my dad asked, his hand gripping the edge of the wooden dock so hard his knuckles turned white. "Tall fella. Looks like he's trying too hard to be a local," the old man replied. "Wears a police-issue sunshade, asking questions he shouldn't be asking." Derek. He hadn't just fled the country. He had come straight to the source. He wasn't just hiding. He was trying to find Arthur to squeeze him for a final payout, or to kill the only man who could prove Derek was the one who hacked the accounts. The hunt for the inheritance had turned into a hunt for a human being. We found the blue house with the yellow door just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, turning the Caribbean Sea into a sheet of liquid orange. The house looked abandoned, the porch covered in a fine layer of sand. But as we approached, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A pair of size 12 tactical boots, the kind Derek had worn every day on the force, were sitting by the side of the house, caked in mud. "He's inside," I whispered to my dad. The silence of the island was suddenly broken by a muffled shout from within the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of a chair being overturned. We didn't wait for the FBI. We didn't call for help. We ran toward the door. The yellow door wasn't locked. It swung open to reveal a room filled with filing cabinets and a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room, Derek had a frail, white-haired man pinned against a desk. My cousin looked feral. His hair was matted with sweat. His clothes were stained, and the heroic cop persona had completely dissolved into the face of a desperate addict. "Where is the offshore key, Arthur?" Derek screamed, shaking the old man. "You owe me. I lost everything because of this family. You're going to give me those passwords, or you're not leaving this island." "Derek, stop!" my dad yelled, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Derek spun around, startled. When he saw us, he didn't look ashamed. He looked enraged. You followed me? You always were the golden boy, weren't you? Grandpa's favorite. Well, look at us now. We're all criminals. The feds are going to take it all anyway." "It doesn't have to be like this," I said, stepping forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. "The FBI knows you did the hack, Derek. If you hurt him, there's no coming back. Drop him." "I've got nothing left to drop." Derek lunged toward my dad, but his weeks on the run had taken their toll. He was slow, clumsy. My dad, fueled by years of silent frustration, met him halfway. It wasn't a cinematic fight. It was a desperate, ugly struggle between two men over the legacy of a dead father. The struggle ended when Derek slipped on a loose stack of papers. Ironically, the very financial records he'd been searching for. He went down hard, his head hitting the edge of a steel cabinet with a sickening thud. He didn't get back up. He wasn't dead, but he was out. Minutes later, the local Royal Cayman Islands police, tipped off by the FBI who had been tracking our passports, swarmed the house. They didn't come in with sirens. They came in with the quiet efficiency of a trap being snapped shut. As they zip-tied Derek's hands behind his back, he finally regained consciousness. He looked at me, not with anger this time, but with a hollow, empty stare. The greed that had fueled him for 25 years had finally burned out, leaving nothing but a shell of a man. Arthur, trembling and clutching a glass of water, looked at my dad. "I never meant for him to find me," the old man whispered. "I was sending the money to help the family, not to destroy it. I thought your father was keeping it safe." "He was," my dad said, looking at the bruised and broken cousin being led away. "He was keeping it safe from people like him. Back in the States, the FBI interrogation rooms felt a lot less intimidating now that we had Arthur as a cooperating witness. It turned out my grandfather wasn't a money launderer. He was a protector." Arthur explained that the secret accounts were actually a structured settlement from a botched business deal in the 80s. Arthur had been the fall guy, and the money was his hush money. He had been funneling it to my grandfather with a single instruction: use this only if the family is in absolute ruin. Grandpa had never touched a cent of it. He had lived frugally, bought his socks at Costco, and drove that old truck because he wanted us to earn our own way. He kept Arthur's blood money hidden because he knew that if people like Derek found out about it, it would corrupt them. "Your grandfather was the most honest man I ever met," Agent Miller admitted, closing her notebook. "He wasn't hiding taxes. He was hiding a temptation. Because the money was legally Arthur's settlement and had been properly taxed before entering the clearinghouse, the federal liens were slowly lifted. The Arthur accounts were seized as part of the ongoing investigation into the original business deal. But my grandfather's actual estate, the house, the savings, the jewelry, was finally cleared. With the federal investigation concluded and Derek in custody awaiting extradition for hacking and interstate flight, the estate was finally settled. The nuclear clause remained in full effect. Because Derek had attempted to seize and manipulate the estate through his digital hack and his theft of the jewelry, his entire share was officially redistributed. My sister and I didn't just get our original inheritance. We received the portion Derek had spent his life obsessing over. The final tally? After legal fees and the cost of the Cayman Islands expedition, the amount Derek lost was staggering. He had traded a guaranteed $3 million for a jail cell and a divorce. I used a portion of my share to set up a trust for Derek's 3 children. They shouldn't have to pay for the sins of their father, and I wanted to make sure the gremlins had a chance to grow up into something better than the man who had tried to ruin me. I stood in my grandfather's room one last time, looking at the empty nightstand where the lockbox used to be. The house was quiet. No noisemakers. No slamming drawers. Just the peace of a debt finally, truly paid. It's been a few years since the summer of the nuclear will. The younger cousin. She's still on her plot of land, thriving. We grab coffee once a month, and she still shakes her head at her brother's stupidity. She's the only part of that side of the family I still talk to. The nurse wife. She moved 2 states away. Last I heard, she's on her 3rd marriage, still looking for a payday that will never come. She hasn't seen Derek since the day she served him papers. Derek. He's serving a 10-year sentence in a federal facility. He lost his badge, his family, and his freedom. He's back in rehab programs. But this time, there are no grandparents to pay the bill. He's finally facing the one thing he couldn't manipulate. The truth, me. I finished college debt-free and started a career in, ironically, forensic accounting. I spend my days finding the Dereks of the world before they can hurt anyone else. I still have that old photo of Grandpa and Arthur. I keep it on my desk as a reminder. Money doesn't change who you are. It just magnifies it. If you're a good man like my grandfather, it makes you a protector. If you're a man like Derek, it makes you a monster. I think I'll stick to being a protector. So that's the full story. From a $40 middle school debt to a multi-million-dollar federal manhunt. Life has a funny way of bringing things full circle. Derek thought he could use his power to crush a kid, but he forgot that the kid would eventually grow up and learn how to fight back. If you've stuck with me through all 27 parts of this journey, thank you. This story is a testament to the fact that patience and integrity will always outlast greed and manipulation. What's the biggest family drama you've ever witnessed? Was it about money or something deeper? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I have plenty more stories of justice and revenge coming your way. Until next time, stay safe, keep your lockboxes tight, and never let the bullies win.